Yeah, so that's a very interesting academic history. I also have a degree in philosophy and also in
Oh,
literature. So I have a
nice.
bachelor's degree in philosophy, master's degree in English. And so I do want to spend some time talking about perhaps the connection between those things and style, because I think that there likely is a connection, at least in the sense of just having a broad or general appreciation for the past. I do want to come back to that. But for now,
Yeah.
I was really curious about your Instagram. There's a lot of very interesting passages on your Instagram. So I noticed, for example, in your name on Instagram, you have I believe it's a quote, but I might be wrong, "Why we remain in the provinces." And I also noticed that you use that as a tag for your photos. So what is that an allusion to?
It is quite obscure. I'm not sure this is going to be like super interesting to everybody, but I mean, it has two ways. Like, it is a reference to the philosopher Martin Heidegger, the famous German philosopher of the early part of the 20th century, famously was a Nazi for a while, which is perhaps not the best, thing to start with, but that's what everyone knows about Martin Heidegger. But he's also the most widely read existential philosopher from the early 20th century. So there's sort of the good with the bad, this kind of traditions. Not to get into that whole can of worms, but there is a very famous essay by Martin Heidegger called "Why We Stay in the Provinces" or "Why We Remain in the Provinces," depending on how you want to translate it. And it's just him getting offered a job in Berlin at the center of the academic world, but rejecting it, explaining his reasons why he doesn't think philosophy can be done in Berlin vis-a-vis where he actually lived, which was in the small city of Freiburg and in this little hut in the Black Forest. So it's sort of a rejection of the city. And for me, the way I use it is more of a joke, because I would obviously have preferred to stay in the city. But I got an academic job in Minnesota. So that's where that came from, this sort of rather jokey embrace of provincial pattern. But there is a small point to it, namely that at the current moment, there is like a corrective sort of way to refusing to be right in the middle of things. I mean, that's not, for me, it's not been by choice. I've bounced around places where unless your career forces you, maybe you would not choose to live. It's much less fashionable to live in like Indianapolis, Cincinnati, and Minnesota than it is to that's not what you associate with menswear. So there is so when I did the Instagram that way, it was sort of an obvious sort of jokey rebuke to the urban-centered, New York-centered, or London-centered menswear scene that I found, something I couldn't be a part of even if I wanted to, because I don't live there. But basically probing that angle a little bit. Is it possible that at a certain moment in sort of in our historical moment, is it possible that there is sort of a rural or provincial corrective to the mainstream? I mean, we saw a little bit of that during COVID. People were trying to leave the cities. People were sort of reaffirming or at least that very fantasy of escaping the city and to have like more to slow things down, etc. I'm not really a part of that type of traditionalism at all, but for me, it was an angle to which to approach these things, because all the photos I took was, taken in a rural, in a provincial setting. So it's kind of an answer to your question. But,
I see.
Yeah.
So could we explore that just for a second? I know that you said that it's probably not the most interesting part, but it's fascinating to me. What connection do you think there is between the provincialism and style? Like, why would you choose that as your name?
Yeah, the idea of the provincialism, what Heidegger also says in that essay, is that basically there is, at a certain moment in history where the being in the midst of things is more confusing or less conducive to clarity of thought than than a withdrawal. There are certain moments in the history of thought, history of all kinds of things, that sort of when a certain kind of withdrawal is actually more radical or more avant-garde, you say, that you can say, than being sort of in the midst of the coolest thing right now. And for me, I think that is not wrong.
I apologize for interrupting, but I guess what I'm angling at here is I'm trying to understand the connection between provincialism and style. Like, you have a style page, so why specifically, or how does that pertain to style, I guess?
Style is the difficult part. It certainly has been done. If you think about, food culture in the last decade or so, that has definitely been happening, where a lot of great new restaurants, for instance, are not in New York City, but are like up in the Hudson Valley, or so pretty much withdrawn from the urban centers. You have to actually travel to go there to eat the food and so on. So the impetus in cooking for a good few years has been closer to the resources, or closer to those things that make up the very fabric of things. You've seen it throughout art history quite often, where artists will withdraw from the city and then do their actual creative work outside. And I see people in, like, even tailors, people in clothing that are leaving the city and finding a way to reconnect with certain things in a more provincial setting. Part of that is because a lot of American cities are at a breaking point in terms of cost of living and so on. This is kind of an economic question. Now, a lot of people have asked this question. I think it's true. Like, at a certain moment, the cost of living in a place like New York City is just an incredible burden. If you want to be creative, or have any kind of creative space to explore something, you actually have to withdraw from something like that. If you want to open, if you're a sous chef at a big restaurant in New York, you can never open your own place. You have to go to Indianapolis to do that. I know, and I have noticed in the last few years when I'm living in these places, people my age, younger, a little bit older, who are from the Midwest and these rural places, return in order to because there simply is not feasible to pursue what they want to do there. In terms of style, it's an open question. There isn't, because these places that I've lived don't have really much of a menswear scene at all. It has a couple of interesting vintage sellers usually, or one or two stores that will carry certain brands that have broader acceptance in menswear. If you want to get a good pair of jeans, there's like maybe one place in Kansas City you can go, or there's one place in Minneapolis, not more. And it's we're going to go on to Ivy style in a second, but a lot of these classic styles had, of course, a much larger spread. So when you're interested in vintage clothing, for instance, there is an advantage. You can much more easily find certain things in say Missouri than you can on the East Coast, for instance, in terms of certain classic menswear component. I've had quite a good luck with that. So, but I feel I have to disappoint you in the sense that there isn't like a consistent philosophy of provincialism in style that I can, in good faith, advance at this point. Because the truth is, style is terrible in the Midwest. It is much, much worse. And just spending a few days, even in Chicago, which is not great, but even like a few days in New York City is just a completely different planet in terms of style wise. Here, you will almost never see anyone looking interesting in almost any way. That's very, very rare. So there is not much to defend. So for me, it remains a polemical angle. It's probably true for a lot of things except for style, but what my Instagram account maybe wants to say, like, maybe, what if like a provincial account is possible? And what would that, and I think my Instagram is a contributor to see what would that look like, style that's out of place in this way. And at the very bottom of that is, of course, that I am not at home in this country. I'm in a sense, I've started to think about it as a sort of self-imposed exile almost by now. This has been quite long. And
doesn't that make you technically an expatriate?
Well, I am technically an expatriate, but exile is a more dramatic way of putting it, because it's sort of that puts away that there are external reasons for why it's not entirely of your own volition, right? Which it sort of has become by now. I'm not sure, and the idea that I am a little bit out of place, and which leads me to the second tagline in my Instagram, maybe.